Stained glass designs are so beautiful. This is actually a faux stained glass design. We don't do the regular stained glass art at our studio because it's a little dangerous to have all those sharp blades to cut the glass to size and do all that welding. So we use a simpler method that's actually really easy. To do this, we use a paint called gallery glass, and I've got a few of them to show here. This is what it looks like. This is for faux stained glass, and they don't sell it in a whole lot of places. You can buy it online. We buy ours at Hobby Lobby, and it dries clear, mostly. Some of them are opaque, but you just sort of have to play around with them to see what they'll look like when they dry. I actually have a guide here because the bottles won't tell you if they dry clear or not. The name of the color is found on the back here. They make a white, which is opaque when it dries, and they also make a clear and a frost. So with these, because they all look alike in the bottle, even though these will dry looking much different than the white does, I just label them because they all look alike. And so rather than having to flip them over all the time to see what color you've got, and says it on the back, but I just label them with a Sharpie so that I know what's what. Underneath the cap is just a small little nozzle like this, sort of like a glue bottle. And when you paint with these, you actually don't use a brush. You just squeeze the paint directly onto your piece of glass, flood the area, and then use the nozzle to move it around and fill in all of the cracks. So what I have here is a little guide, because I get a lot of people saying, well, what does that color look like when it dries? Because I tell people right away, first thing you need to know is this is not necessarily what it's going to look like when it dries. A lot of your colors are lighter in the bottle, and then they dry darker, and some of them even dry clear. So I have this right here. It's just a guide. It is just a plain frame with just the paper backing taken out, and it took a day or so for this to dry on there because the paints do take a while to set. But I just did a little dot of each color and went and labeled underneath what color it is so that you can sort of see for yourself if that's the color you want to use, and you know what it's truly going to look like on your glass. So this is a really handy guide. People love having this at their disposal whenever we're doing a faux stained glass class, because you really need to see something like this. For example, the honey quartz up here dries with that frosty look. It's not shiny, but it's not quite opaque. But it does dry quite a bit darker than what you see in the bottle. So it's good to have a guide, and you can create something like this for yourself very easily if you're going to work with something like this at home. So here's an example of one. This one's got the parrot on there. And on this one, I actually didn't even fill in the space between. I just left that glass as is. They look really nice when you hang them up in a window so the light can catch them, especially when you're using all of these clear, the transparent paints. If you're using the opaque ones like the yellow, you're going to see a little bit of shadow here if this is hanging up in the light, but those leaves, the light really catches them, and they look really nice when they're hanging up. But here's sort of my method. I'm going to show how I do my little setup. So you start with just a very cheap little dollar store frame like this, a document frame, something like this. But you're going to take the glass out. So you flip it over and be very gentle with these little prongs because they're weak, and if you bend them too many times, they will weaken. And so you don't want them snapping off, or else you'll have a hard time keeping your glass in there. But just open up all those little areas. Try not to do all of them if you can help it. Maybe save one side and just open the ones you need to get your glass out. And take the backing out and on the paper insert as well, because we don't need that. Now, I tell people usually at this point, set your frame aside, because it's nice to put it back into the frame when you're done. That way you have some way to display it. But what I also like to do is get this little hanger attached onto it. I just use a staple gun, and I find some kind of nice string, something decorative, maybe something a little bit thicker so it'll stay put in there. You could use some twine or maybe some hemp cord and just trim off these extra pieces right here. But it does a really good job of hanging it up securely, and you don't have to worry about it falling down. So that's something you could do before or after, but I would recommend taking the glass out first. That way you don't have any possibility of your glass cracking when you're using that pressure to put your staple in there. So that's that. We'll set this aside. We don't need it right now. We'll get it out of our way. So then you have your glass, which you'll want to be very gentle with. And I usually say try to use 2 hands, one hand on each side of it, because you don't want to put any unnecessary pressure on that glass as you're lifting it up. You don't want to have too much weight on one side. So keep both hands on it as much as you can when you go to take it out of the package. So then you start with an image, a really simple shape or drawing, nothing with too much detail, because as you'll see, as these paints start to go on, they're very they spread out, and so you can't do a whole lot of detail. I picked out the colors that I want to use for my painting because I'm going to do a cardinal. So I've got a few different reds. I know this one looks so pretty, like a nice pink in the bottle, but when it dries, it's going to look like this right here. This is magenta rose, and so it's going to look very red. So I'm going to use it as a red for my cardinal. Gallery Glass brand does make a pink, but it's not the prettiest. You can sort of mix them together with white if you wanted it to be a nice light pink. But I've also pulled out a regular red, which dries very dark and bold. And then this shimmer red. So I've got 3 different reds that I'll be using on my cardinal. I pulled out these to show, but I'm not going to be using them for my background. I actually want to save on these, and I'm going to use something different because these paints are pretty pricey. And so you want to try not to waste them and go sparingly if you can. So what I'm going to use for my background, I'm just going to take regular clear Elmer's glue, and actually when it dries, it's going to look and feel almost exactly like the crystal clear. This is crystal clear Gallery Glass, which is this right here, but $2.75 a bottle versus whatever this is, 75 cents during back to school sales. I'm going to use this because you get a lot more in the bottle, and I don't have to feel so bad about really flooding that area and getting it all over. So before we can do that, we're going to get this image put onto the glass by putting it behind the glass and taking a Sharpie to just draw it and transfer it right on there. This part is pretty easy to do because it doesn't slide around on you, and you can go and just mark off all of this area. So after we do that, we'll go over our Sharpie lines with some puffy paint, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let's get this just Sharpied on here, and then we'll come back to it. So I have all of my lines covered now with Sharpie. And if you're working on a solid colored surface, unlike me, you'll be able to see this very easily. If I was to just slip the piece of paper under it, you can see that you've got all your lines on there, and just the basic shapes that you know where you're putting your puffy paint. Now, we use puffy paint to sort of create a little wall to block off the areas where we're going to flood the color. So I talk about puffy paint, I'm talking about these little guys right here. This is with the t-shirts. You'll find it with the t-shirt paints, and they're just dimensional paints. You can squeeze them on thick and they'll dry that way. They take a long time to dry, but they will dry with some dimension. They won't flatten out. These little bottles are really easy to handle, so I like the small bottles, although they do make the larger bottles. What I do though with the larger bottles is, as these smaller bottles start to get low and hard to squeeze the paint out, or you're finding that you're having to shake it quite a bit to get the paint to come out the nozzle, I'll just pop the top off of these and use the larger bottles to refill them. And so that's why I buy the larger bottles, but I like handling the smaller bottles, and usually the kids do too, because the smaller hands, it's just easier to get a grip of it. You don't have to worry so much about holding on to something big or heavy or hard to squeeze. And so I'll go over all of these Sharpie lines with the puffy paint, because we're creating a little wall where we're going to block off the area where that color is going to go, so that way our paints over here don't run into each other and we don't have any colors mixing. It also is creating an outline where our shape is going to be, so we can see what that's going to look like. So let me go now and just go over all of my lines with this puffy paint. I say you can go over this slowly, just squeeze slow and steady, do small sections at a time. And if you're not sure about this and you've never done it before, just practice a little bit on paper by practicing doing some squiggles with it, maybe some zigzags, so that you can get a feel for how hard you have to squeeze this, because it's very different from probably what you're used to, and it's also very different from the Gallery Glass, because you barely have to squeeze this bottle to get the paint to come out, versus the puffy paint, you have to squeeze it with a little more pressure. So practice that before you go for it, but you can always just use a wet wipe and clean up your mess if you end up going outside the lines. So let's get all of our Sharpie lines covered over with the puffy paint right now. now all of the Sharpie lines have been covered over with that dimensional paint. It's also shiny just like you see it. When it dries, it'll stay just like this, but it is going to take a while to dry. The cool thing is you don't have to let it dry before you can start putting your gallery glass paints on there. You can just go for it. You just have to be careful once you get up close with the nozzle. Once you get up close to those wet lines, just be aware that they are still wet, so if you're not careful, you might drag a little bit of black into your colored area, and you can always fix it up with a cotton swab or a toothpick, so it's good to have some of those handy. Also, if your little puffy paint bottles become clogged, it's really easy to unclog them. Just take a little tack or a push pin or a needle, something, and get inside the nozzle and just kind of carefully pick that dried paint out of there. Or you can just take a scissor and just trim off just the tip of it, and usually it'll open it back up for you. But just don't lose the caps, and that shouldn't happen. And close them up as soon as you're done. So now that this is ready to go, you usually should have a plan in your mind of what these colors are going to look like. I know this is a cardinal, so I know he's going to be red. I know my background, all these major areas are going to be the clear. I'm going to use Elmer's glue for that. I'll figure out something for my flower. I might use white for the flower, make it like a daisy with a yellow center. Yellow for the beak, of course, and then I have the brown color and the leaves here for the branch. So I've got what I need for that. When these will start to dry a little bit near the edge, you'll start to see wherever your paint is thin is where it'll start to dry a little quicker, but something like this will need to sit for a whole day before you can really come and hang it up, stick it in the frame, do what you're going to do with it. So let's get started putting the colors in here. I really like cardinals, and they're really easy to spot. That's probably why I like them. We're lucky enough to see quite a bit of wildlife around here, and we see a whole lot of deer. We see sandhill cranes everywhere, and every once in a while, if you're lucky, you see a cardinal. So this one's going to be my little cardinal painting, and those red colors really pop. You don't get to use a lot of red when you're painting, so let's make the most of this one and do something fun. So what I'm doing here, if you can tell, I'm sort of starting with the outline. I'm getting close to the black lines with this, well, right now using the glue, Elmer's glue, and then I'm just sort of squeezing around in the area, roughly coloring it in, and then when I'm moving it around with just the nozzle of the bottle, I'm actually not squeezing. Some of it may be dripping out just a little bit because of gravity, but I'm actually not squeezing after that. I'm no longer using any pressure. I'm just moving it around. And if you wanted to, you could even close off the nozzle just to be sure you're not wasting any. You don't need a whole lot of paints on here. The more you pile it on, it just becomes unnecessary and it takes longer to dry. So I say don't add any paint that you don't need, because then you're just wasting your money and using up all that nice color that you could use for another project. So I'll just keep going. I have one last little section to do. The reason why it looks nice to do the glue or the clear background versus just leaving it like it is, like on the other one that I showed with the parrot, is that putting the glue down gives it a little texture, and it makes it look like it has some raised areas, some bumps on there, and the light hits it in a different way. So it sort of gives it that neat little beveled look. So that's why we do it that way. But you could definitely leave this plain in the background if you wanted to, and that would look okay too. Just depends on the style you're going for. So all my clear areas are done, and the only thing that I have left to do now is the branch that he's sitting on. So I'm going to use the honey quartz. It just comes out to be, remember, like a yellow ochre, a bit of a darker yellow, and it's that frosty look when it's done, so it won't be shiny like the rest of him. And I know he doesn't really look much like a cardinal because of all the pink and purple, but like we already talked about, these colors look very different when they're dry. That purple color that you see on there is actually going to look like this when it's dry. It's going to be kind of like a cranberry color with those shimmery pieces of glitter in there. And then the pink area that you see here on his tummy, that's actually going to look more like this. So it kind of looks like a very hot pink, almost red color. And then of course that's our ruby red, where his head and tail were done in those colors. So he's going to look very different when he dries. And I love this ivy color for the leaves. So this is our ivy. It's just a deep, deep dark green, and I really like it to contrast well with our clear background. Got that nice bright white flower right behind him, and then our really popping red cardinal right there. So when I squeeze the paints on there, sometimes you'll get a little air bubble, and you'll see that happening every once in a while. Sometimes though, you're able to use the nozzle right away if you catch it and just pop it with the nozzle of the paint as you're going through. When you can't, sometimes your paint is stubborn, or sometimes you just shook it up a little too much, because they do settle, and sometimes you do need to give them a shake before you use them. But the problem is sometimes when you shake them, they end up forming those bubbles, and those bubbles will stay there on your glass. And I don't really mind it. It doesn't bother me. I figure you're going to hang these up and they're going to be far enough away from your eyes that you're not going to be able to see any small little imperfections that might pop up in there. But if it does bother you, then you can always take a needle or a toothpick, and like I said before, it's good to have these over here anyways because you might need it to clean up a little spot. But you can take it and just pop that little bubble as it pops up. If you get it right away, it's easier. If you wait a while, you'll see a little skin starting to form on top of your paint, and it becomes harder to pop those bubbles. But they really don't look bad when they dry. If you look back at one that is already dry, you can see what a bubble looks like as it settles in there and doesn't get popped. Just sort of looks like that. Just a little dot there on your paint. Not very noticeable, and nothing that would bother anybody. There's another one right there. And sometimes these just pop up as it's starting to dry, and they're a little stubborn and they don't want to go away when you poke them with a pin. So this cardinal is going to be done, and we just have to let him dry. Wait about a day for him to be dry, then you can pop him back into the frame that we've already set up with our little hanger on there. You hang him up on a window or somewhere where he's catching the light, and these look so nice when they're done. And really, if you don't know a whole lot about stained glass, they could look like the real thing, and that's what's so fun about them. You don't have to use black for your outline either. If you have puffy paint in a different color, why not try a different color? I think gold will look really nice on something like this, or even white, if you just swap the colors out a little bit and do your outline in a different color. I think if you were to switch it to some other neutral color, I think it would look really neat. So we'll let this guy dry, and he'll be all done.